Hi, and welcome back to CISPA TL, the cybersecurity podcast of the CISPA Helmholtz Center for Information Security. Each month, we're talking to our researchers who are tackling all aspects of information security and AI. We're trying to get them to explain their research in a way that you will know what they're talking about, even if you don't have a computer science degree. I should know, as I don't have one either. My name is Tobias Ebelshäuser, and I'm from CISPA's Communications Department. Before I get to introduce today's guest, I want to shamelessly do some advertising on our own behalf. CISPA science communication projects, including this podcast, have been awarded the State Prize for Design by the German federal state of Saarland. So I just want to take a second to say thank you to everyone who has been listening to this podcast and supporting our work in the last few years. If you want to know more about the award, check out our website or social media channels. And now finally to today's guest of honor, Dr. Ali Abbasi. CISPA's CSO, or Chief Sarcasm Officer, as he likes to refer to himself, joined us from Bochum in 2022 as an addition to our faculty lineup. Hi Ali, welcome and thanks for joining our podcast.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You are working on something that is fundamentally affecting our everyday life, yet very few of us have actually seen with our own eyes. So I am talking about satellites. How did you come to work on satellite security?
So first of all, I always loved aerospace, engineering. I liked airplanes from childhood. I mean, okay, who doesn't, especially boys? Like, I don't know if you ask them, what do you want to become? You want to become a pilot or something?
Yeah, I wanted to.
Yeah, so I always liked the idea. And I recall first time I was looking for research topic when I was PhD student, the first year PhD student. And I told my supervisor, hey, I want to actually work on security of ISS, like International Space Station.
You were already into cybersecurity back then?
Yeah, of course. I was already in the cybersecurity domain. And I told my supervisor, hey, I want to actually work on ISS security because I actually read a manual at the time, which ISS was running Windows ME software like in there. So we are talking about 2013.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, this should be very bad. Like,
So for the people that know, ME, it was actually the Millennium Edition, I think. So that's what the name says. So 2000.
Yeah, exactly. So like it was very old operating system, and especially this Windows, so not very reliable. And they were talking about the like basically oxygen generation software like is running Windows ME. And I was like, okay, that's terrible. So I wanted to work on this. And my professor looked at me and said, are you crazy? Like there is no way you can actually just access to any of this stuff. It's very hard to actually work in this domain. And I don't think it makes sense, which I think he was right. So fast forward, I think some years later, I was a postdoc and I was looking at some of the data or like some of the information about some satellites. And then again, it came up that, hey, this looks like very bad. Some of the things which we were seeing was not okay. So specifically, there was a project I was working on security of firmware. So like for embedded systems. So that's in case I didn't introduce myself like completely. I work on embedded system security. And one of the test cases we had was a satellite. So like we specifically asked a group, a student satellite group, like, or the student satellite designer group to give us their firmware. And then we looked at it and it was terrible. And we said, maybe actually like now is the better time to basically look at these things because it was becoming more open. There were many universities which were designing satellites and launching it. So like the idea was maybe we can now look at these things. There is a specific term for it. We call it new space era, which like there are many satellites being launched by smaller like players to the space with shared software between different users. So like basically a university doesn't design the whole satellite. It gets some of the software stack from another company. And then basically another university does the same or another company does the same. So what is happening is that the accessibility of these components are becoming more and more open to people. So, and that's actually a good point for us. So we saw this opportunity and I said, okay, I talked with my supervisor that, hey, I want to actually work on satellites. And my supervisor was actually, it's a good idea. So So I thought it's open, everything is great. But we started by basically contacting lots of universities who are doing satellites, some companies, like big companies, Airbus, others. Hey, we want to actually work on this domain. Would you be willing to share your command and data handling software system? And then everybody was like, absolutely not.
So but thanks for asking.
Yes. So it was like we are asking too much. So, but actually, it took me 2 years to talk with many, many parties. And eventually we had 3 candidates. So always for us, or at least internal discussion we had about the work, was that there must be 3 samples. Because it's enough to say, okay, it's not just a one single case or second or just by chance second one, but it's 3 cases we have, concrete cases, which demonstrate certain problems or not, or we can actually demonstrate that this is how it's going right now. So after 2 years, we convinced certain groups, a company, and also 2 universities to basically, or we should say 3 universities, but one of them co-developed by Airbus Defense and Space. So to share their satellite command and data handling framework. So a little bit background, command and data handling is basically like the brain of the satellite. So it's basically process all the commands which you are sending to satellites and basically decide for what should happen in the satellite. So control most of the things. And also communicate with all of the subsystems of the satellite. So that's basically how I came to the idea of working on satellites. I can, of course, expand it further.
No, it's perfectly fine. I mean, I think what's very interesting is that you're saying that nowadays there are even more satellites being launched by universities and maybe even players that haven't been launching satellites in the past. Maybe to take a step back, what are satellites being used for historically and today? And has that changed over the years?
So I would say first, I wouldn't look at what they are being used for. So who are the users? Most of the time, for a long time, it was governments, right? So it was primarily governments who were allowed to basically operate in this space. And therefore, what they were using for, of course, what the government does, for example, I don't know, for information gathering, for basically weather, monitoring, and for the this kind of application. So, for example, communication and this kind of thing. So, I think fast forward with the new space era, it's a little bit changed. So, and I call it paradigm shift, where it was not anymore governments who were using satellites for communication and also weather monitoring, weather forecast, or intelligence mission or something, but they actually changed to companies, third-party companies providing services, right? And then the launch cost decreased significantly, and as a result, there were more and more companies who are operating in this space. So there was a big change from what it was used for before to now many different applications. Sometimes it's just research labs, sometimes for testing solar panels of a specific company outside of space. So there are lots of companies are developing components and they are launching components to basically test things.
Okay.
There are universities now, so lots of student groups independent from their research chair who are actually developing satellites. And so the missions are basically changing from just purely governmental oriented needs to basically public needs. So I think the most significant one, of course, is Starlink, right? So for communication, so they are one of the biggest players in this era. And also another aspect we have to look is that at the time, in the past, with the governments, it was mostly geosynchronous orbit or geo orbits and very few LEO satellite or low Earth orbit satellites were operating. Background, 36,000 kilometer geo, below 1,000 is basically LEO. You also have very low Earth orbit, which is around 200 kilometers. So there are different orbits. So for example, spy missions generally are or spy satellites are basically mostly LEO because they're closer to Earth. They want to take a picture and they want to gather this information. While communication ones, it might be in geo or because they can always look at a specific region and cover it because they are always synchronous with the rotation of the Earth.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And so that's basically how it changed. And as a result, now you have many, many LEO satellites and a new space era, which we talked about, also happening in that orbit. So basically LEO, low Earth orbit. And there is cheap to launch. And at the same time, it's very easy to communicate. You don't need any more very expensive equipment to communicate with these satellites. While for the geo orbits, basically with a 36,000 kilometer orbit, the satellites are too far. You need a very powerful transmitter to actually communicate with them.
When I think about satellites, I have no idea how to communicate with them. I'm just going to assume that there's no Wi-Fi in low Earth orbit. So if I want to talk to my satellite, how do I do that?
So generally, you basically have a ground station with some transmitters and basically antennas to receive signals. So you can actually operate in different frequencies. So what we call as specific frequencies UHF, VHF. So that's the simplest one. These signals are basically omnidirectional. They go around all the way. You can cover half of Europe when you are transmitting something. And but the data rates of those communications are very low. So that's one way to communicate with your satellite. Oftentimes, lots of university satellites are basically operating on that frequency. So basically, they're having a radio on the satellite, which have a receiver or transceiver. And then you basically send something called telecommands to the satellite. And the satellite send back telemetry. So telecommands are your commands, which you are sending to your satellite, which you say, I don't know, take a picture of this part or make these measurements. And then telemetry data are those basically information about the satellite, or sometimes payload data, which is like the picture you took. But of course, the downside is that with the low Earth orbit satellites, you have a very small time window to make a communication because they are fast and they are basically the basically line of sight time window you have is very short. It's 4 minutes.
Okay.
Right. And then within these 4 minutes, the angle of the satellite mission might not be always the best angle. Yeah. So maybe you have 2-3 minutes really to basically send your telecommands and receive the data. The problem is that with UHF, VHF communications, oftentimes you have a very low bandwidth. So the speed is 1 kilobyte per second, right? So imagine you have, 2 minutes, 3 minutes window. You are thinking about 200 kilobytes of data you can send to the satellite or receive.
Yeah, it's not exactly 5G.
Exactly. So the satellites are still operating in those domains. So of course, the more expensive ones, they are communicating with different bands. So X band, S band, KU band, all of those bands, which are, first of all, the signals are directional. So it means that it's not anymore broadcasted everywhere. Yeah. It's basically like a beam, which is pointed towards a specific direction. Of course, it is very challenging to have it on satellites, and generally satellites, especially for LEO satellites, you have problem with the cost because, if you are having a directional antenna, it means that you might need, not always, but you might need to basically have a attitude determination software or reactionary wheel inside the satellite to stabilize the satellite and point it to a specific direction, right? And that's basically already very expensive. So lots of satellites might say, do we really need that? And therefore, when you look at the satellites, especially LEO satellites, especially for smaller companies making it, they are very simple communication form.
But how often will that 2 to 3 minute window pass around? Is it every 24 hours or?
Depending on satellite and orbit, so you can say, yes, you can have it multiple times, but pass around over you, it might be 2 times, and that's all, right? Okay. In a day, right? And another day, it might not be in an angle which you want. So because you might look at the horizon, right? Not up.
Yeah.
And the satellite is over the horizon.
Way
exactly.
Longer. Yeah.
Exactly. So therefore, it might not be optimal for you to actually. Every pass is not a perfect pass. Okay. So it's there are perfect passes, and you basically can use those perfect passes to communicate with your satellite. But if you want better communication way, and oftentimes for these companies, one of the things they do is that they make the satellite cheaper by not putting a S-band antenna and all of those things, but then they rent more ground stations.
Okay. So you have multiple transmitters on the ground.
Exactly. So like, for example, I don't know if you know, there is ground station as a service. So for example, Amazon AWS also allow it.
Okay.
For example, you can rent a ground station. Or if you are companies or partners, you are basically going to rent each other a ground station or like borrow each other ground station. There are some protocols to allow one ground station from your own ground station control a satellite via a third party ground station. So like, and then you can actually send commands to the satellite, telecommands, or receive data as well. So this way you increase your observation or like the line of sight, because you are not just anymore using your own ground station.
Okay. So UHF, VHF, I think I remember that from my grandmother's old TV. It worked on VHF band with the old analog TV that's no longer transmitted. I mean, how much does it realistically cost for me to build a transmitter so I can talk to a satellite?
So nowadays, so depends. So if you want to just receive some commands from satellite, it's very cheap. We are talking about like €100.
Okay.
If you are talking about transmitting and sending telecommands to the satellite, then we are looking around like €8,000, something like that.
But still, I mean, that's not like a huge figure that someone is not going to be able to afford. So I think the most pressing question is that communication secure? I don't know if a university is talking to their satellite in low Earth orbit. Is that communication secure, or is there a real threat of some malicious actor with €10,000 lying around will be able to hijack that?
So most of the time, the communication are not secure. Especially it is the case in Europe and especially in Germany. And I tell you why. So to operate, first of all, you have to see like oftentimes with these low satellites, they are cost conscious, right? So you don't want to make it super expensive unless, again, you are a government or like you are like a super big company, and then it's fine because you are making more money eventually out of it. But if you are basically looking at like smaller players, smaller companies, and that's basically exactly the new era, new space era, and also basically all of these companies which are now operating in Europe or in US on this domain, on low Earth orbit satellites, then the answer is a little bit different. So, for example, for universities or cost-conscious companies, the problem is that you might have to use amateur radio bandwidth, right? Because it's cheaper, basically, because it's something that you can actually use without much concern. But guess what? In amateur radio bandwidth, you are not allowed to encrypt your communication, right? So what will happen, because the government should be able to monitor this bandwidth. Okay. So suddenly, if you are cost conscious, well, you can't have encryption at all.
Okay.
Right? So for example, in Germany, you cannot do that.
Okay.
And as a result, you have satellite communication. For most of European satellites, actually, as far as I know, they don't often deploy any kind of encryption. So
the signal is just out there.
Yeah. So like basically the easiest thing, which I think you could do is that like, I don't know, this university has a satellite. This is public information. And then you go and look, okay, what's their satellite? There is something called TLE data of the satellite, which you can actually know where is the satellite, right? Because we know orbital dynamics, mechanics, and we know exactly where the satellite is going to be at which time. So what you do is that you basically say, okay, their satellite at this time is going to have a perfect path. So maybe they send a telecommand to their satellite. And then, you get an SDR and then go nearby. And basically, because
there are what's an SDR?
Software-defined radio. Okay. So basically, you can program this device. It's like a radio receiver transmitter, which you can actually program it. And you say, you know what, I want to listen to 433 megahertz amateur radio bandwidth because I know that this satellite is not going to use those kind of things. And oftentimes, they provide information about their satellites, what frequency they are operating, because of the regulation again. So like because they have to like provide this information. And then after doing that, then you can just wait and listen. And when they are transmitting very like with a high power, not very high power from the government perspective or something, but like
still high enough.
Yes,
for
it's
two
very
blocks.
high enough that you can be, I don't know, like 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer, 5 kilometer even, and you receive it very clearly. You get the like information from the signal. So, and then basically you can capture the telecommands. So, which is kind of bad, I would say. So no security, like most of the time. And again, so there are possibilities to provide security then going to other bandwidths, but then you are thinking about additional money which you have to pay. There are lots of restriction how you can use those frequencies or how long you can use them. So oftentimes for universities, for smaller companies, it doesn't make sense. So to me, it's like, and that's why I always call it paradigm shift, is that like you have a situation which is like you are like making a perfect like situation for security issues, because you have cost issues, you have like regulatory like issues with how you are using the bands like or like frequencies, and then very ease of access for everybody to communicate with the satellites and listening to them.
Yeah. So right now, the only security or the perceived security of a satellite is it doesn't really have an internet connection and people might not know the frequency.
So fortunately, we actually did a survey in a paper this year about satellite firmware security. And we did a survey of satellite developers, and what we found was that oftentimes developers of these satellites, the way they are perceiving security is that nobody knows about my satellite protocol or information about it. But oftentimes what they say is that we do not deploy any kind of encryption or something in our satellite. So the security part of security is the way, right? So this is the way and of course it makes sense from perspective of people who do not work on cybersecurity. So like I said, this is probably going to work. But the problem is that this is getting so easily accessible to so many people. The software which they are using for communication stack, like the communication stack they have, is just public. And then like I can just buy those things and then just know exactly what protocol you are using, because you're not going to like, first of all, most of the time you're not going to design your own protocol, or we actually saw some satellites which design their own protocol, and then this is terrible. It's like, for example, directly execute whatever command coming from radio.
Okay. And do not ask where it's from.
And no encryption. And then if you are listening to their communication few hours or few times, then you actually figure out exactly how their like protocol is working. So, and then their modulation is public because of regulations. So you already know exactly the time they are communicating, the frequency, modulation, basically, and then you are listening to their signals, and then basically you can know what kind of protocol you are using, because oftentimes they're not even designing their own protocol, which I think I wouldn't recommend also to design, but like they are using lots of open source public stuff. So these are not anymore closed source domain. I always use this example. My example is industrial control system. So industrial control systems designed in 1980, 1990. And oftentimes what we had was like systems which are not connected to the internet, right? Nobody actually uses it.
So they're air-gapped.
Exactly. Yeah. Or the assumption was it's air-gapped, right? Yeah. And then like fast forward 2010, right? You have something like Stuxnet.
Which is when the...
Exactly, like with the Iran nuclear program, which they were targeting with the virus, and they were attacking industrial control systems, and many more after, right? So you have many examples: Russians attacking Ukrainians, like some group attack, like Saudi Arabian, Saudi Arabia's like petrochemical plants, Petrorabic. So lots of cases. What happened is that like again there was a change on what was happening and what was the assumption. So the assumption of developers was that nobody basically has access to industrial control systems, right? So therefore, there was no security in these industrial control systems. Oftentimes, there was no even password or anything, no encryption, nothing. You just send a command and execute.
Yeah, because you assumed that just people that basically there's a guy in front of the door not letting people in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. While like... the better example is like when you compare it to something like payment cards, right? So payment cards, especially for example in Europe, or even sometimes I would say like gaming consoles, they have many advanced mitigations to prevent you from like exploiting it. Why? Because the original assumption they were making is that, hey, these guys are gonna just like jailbreak it or like try to make money, either like playing games for free in their consoles, or I don't know, like you don't want people just exploit a bank, like a bank card or something. Yeah. So we should put a lot of effort to basically fix them. And the result was that like for we don't see like very high profile, which suddenly attack every device like in the world at the same time, like in something like payment cards, right? So like they are very secure. They have very robust security. While with industrial control systems, we still basically do not do basics, right? So, and the third comparison is the satellite. So the assumption was always nobody's going to communicate with it because nobody has access to these things. Nobody has a transmitter. You can't have a ground station. Ground station is like over 200,000 euro. Like, I don't know, you have to spend money and like time and have government permission to build a big antennas to basically communicate with the satellites. And suddenly, well, that's not anymore true, because now you can actually pay, I don't know, 8,000 euro and you basically have your own fully fledged ground station, and you are actually licensed to do it because you actually have you can get a amateur radio license to actually operate.
Okay, that sounds like a perfect storm, as you would call it. But I mean, what are we going to do about it? What is a solution you could think about that might actually help in that domain?
So that's I wish I had an answer to it. So I don't think there is a simple solution to problem. You know, I don't believe in simple solution. So I think it's like many different aspects. We have to look at it from different angles. Of course, from the regulatory aspects, we should maybe allow like radio communication, which are encrypted from the government side. So of course, at least for satellites. Of course, the government, has its own concerns about this. So that's you have to solve. And then at the same time, raise awareness from the companies who are developing this component. And now they are selling it right and left to different like end user companies and or the like users basically in a space domain. And user, I mean not the user as basically people who's launched the sat or designed the sat. That hey, you have to actually provide some minimum security like required for these satellites. Like you have to have a minimum security requirement. Maybe we have to make satellites also as critical infrastructure. So this is something that, for example, in US is happening now, that they declared it as critical infrastructure. There were already some regulations about how to protect critical infrastructures and the minimum security requirements. And therefore now companies have to deploy certain security features in the systems.
Okay.
We didn't do it as far as I know yet in Europe.
Just a step in the right direction.
Exactly. So this is a long game.
Okay.
There is no like a switch which I can flip and then satellites are becoming secure. No.
But without now wanting to paint like too of a bleak picture and talking about catastrophes, but there was in 2009, I think there was the first case of two satellites colliding in space. And they were sending space debris all around the orbit, even forcing the ISS to take evasive maneuvers. Like 2 years later, when there was like some tiny debris, smaller than 10 centimeters in size, coming even close to the International Space Station, because they were afraid of it, that it might actually destroy the ISS.
Yeah, it can.
Yeah, so
they are going very fast. So even a small piece actually has enough power to basically just rip through the ISS and make a big hole.
But if we think of these scenarios like satellites colliding and everything, think Michael Bay movie. What's the worst thing that could happen if someone were to gain access of a satellite they should not have access to?
So depending on the satellite they have access. So in the case which you mentioned, it was like in operational satellites and the Iridium satellite from like US company. And basically there was no situational awareness in the space. And as a result, these two satellites basically collided. And after that, I think we have now from NORAD, North American Air Defense, like basically they have a tracking website for all objects, and they provide TLE data or like orbital mechanics data, which they say where your like satellite is, which orbit, which location. And so now they are actually providing tracking information. So like if you are a satellite operator, you can register in a space track website. And then they basically warn you about collision. So there are something like which happened, like at least since then. But the worst case scenario question which you ask, of course, is like the Kessler syndrome. So like basically two satellites like colliding, and what will happen is that generally that orbit generally become unusable, like for like 150 years, 200 years. And then there are other problems that you can have cascading effects. So one satellite hits another one, and then it's basically the derbies of the satellites collision basically hit other satellites, and then other satellites and other satellites. And
so it's a game of domino.
Exactly. And that's basically the worst case scenario can happen. But of course, there are, I would say, more realistic things as well. So like this still is a possibility. We know that it's already happened. Of course, not intentional, but like unintentionally. But there are some other scenarios as well. Is that, for example, if you are spending a lot of money for a big company and designing a satellite and launch it, and then somebody take it over and kick you out.
Okay.
Right. We actually demonstrated one case for one of the European Space Agency satellites, so the Abbasi, which basically we could do that. So basically we could kick out the operators, we could set a password for the satellite by our own, and we set it, and then basically they cannot use it.
So someone could just
hijack
it and keep it for ransom.
Yeah, and it's not like, I don't know, it's in the other office and somebody hacked my server, so I wipe it and then I just take it back. No, it's just it's over. You will not have access to your satellite anymore. So that's another aspect. Or sometimes like people can actually gather the information you are gathering. So like basically like spying on, or like information leakage, let's say, from your satellite. So if you are taking a picture from the Earth, well, I can actually also, if I can have access to your satellite or broken some of your like systems, then passively, without you ever noticing, basically always receive your information as well. And I also can benefit from it. So like there are lots of financial aspects of it. And my feeling is that it's coming. So like there is gonna be this kind of attacks. It's not, I don't even think it's going to be far in the future, because we are thinking about like 40,000 satellites by 2030, right? So like LEO satellites. And right now we had like 4,000.
So it's just a numbers game of increasing the probability.
It's significantly increasing very fast. And there are now, the technology for launching satellites is not anymore just for a specific group of countries or club of countries. It's now becoming very common for lots of countries to actually be able to launch satellites. First off, normally it starts with governments launching it, and then it follows by like universities, smaller companies doing it. So I think it's going to be way more like common, as we know. And yeah, I think the financial aspect of it could make sense. So the attackers from being governments could become basically like the individual attackers or attackers with financial motivation.
Okay. So, but if you had to guess, or if you had to actually gain control of a satellite, how would you do it? Would you build your own ground station, or would you try to gain access to a ground station?
I don't think you necessarily need to build your ground station, because as we talked about before, like there are now the ground station as a service services available. Some countries have less regulatory requirements, right? So nowadays there's something called internet, that you don't have to be in a specific country to do things. So like basically you can actually ask a country which has a way less strict regulatory requirement to basically use their ground station to basically communicate with a satellite or target a satellite. At the same time, satellites do not have situational awareness, meaning that they don't have even designed to detect this kind of activities, right? So they are just trusting everything right now. So basically, even if somebody attack your satellite or try, first time try, it fails, but nobody notices. It's like this is gonna happen all the time, until eventually it works. So
in a computer system, you would probably get some kind of warning or see some anomaly and say, okay.
So again, we are talking about the lower Earth orbit satellites, smaller companies which are designing this thing, which are very, very cost conscious, right? Yeah. But of course, if you are looking at the very big players or governments, maybe they have some situations for, at least for newer satellites. For older satellites, I'm sure that there is no such thing.
So if I have a ground station that is connected to the internet, all of cybersecurity risks that a normal system connected to the internet, so they basically inherit all the security risks that come along with being connected to the internet.
Right. So basically, like ground station have like it's an IT system, right? Yeah. And they're not super complex IT system either. So like they are going to use, I don't know, maybe using VPN or like leak their credentials, because the satellite operators might not be at the site. So they might want to remotely access it. And then there are all of these functionalities which you see in other, for example, industrial control systems. I mean, You see it also in ground station or mission operation centers of satellites. So you can remotely access them. You can rent it as an attacker, like another ground station, and basically try to target satellites.
Okay. Just crazy.
Yeah.
I think, as you said, I think the kind of perfect storm scenario you described is really the best way of putting it. We don't really have a lot of idea how to secure these things, or people haven't even thought about it. Because when Donald Trump actually announced the inception of the US Space Force a few years ago, a lot of people were saying, what the hell is he doing? Even then, others stated that it might not be such a bad idea that we think about security in space, because we are very dependent on a lot of these assets up there. So is it only now that even the authorities are beginning to perceive these risks as real?
Yes, it's actually very, very recent. So for example, I think since 5 years ago, this need for looking into these things, at least in public domain, became clear. You heard maybe about Hackasat competition at DEF CON. So which they started looking at how to hack satellites and stuff. So now 5 times competition. This year competition was actual
satellite. At a cybersecurity conference?
Yes, DEF CON. So it's like a community-driven kind of cybersecurity conference in US. And the US Air Force basically had a competition there. So first time actually we participated, they basically were sending satellites. So there was a flat sat, what we call, 2 participants, they were sending it. And you had to hack a satellite online. But at first you also had a copy of actual satellites.
Ah, okay.
So it's my Bochum, in my room in Bochum, it's there actually. So they started with this kind of activities to raise awareness. And so we know that US Air Force does it for what? It's clear that, okay, there are interest in these things, or there are some problems, and they have to gather talents.
Yeah.
Right? You need more people who are working in this domain. So they are running these kind of programs. So it's clear that they are actually looking at these things, but it's not a very long time since they're actually looking. So oftentimes, there were some aspects of security in satellites were studied. For example, if we are looking at other governments attacking another satellite or cause a problem or jamming it, so this kind of aspects. But cybersecurity, as a whole package, systematically look about all aspects of it, not just cyber warfare or whatever, or electronic warfare. Let's say that's a better term. Was not a thing. So it's very, very new. And you see already just this year, US Air Force launched a satellite for cybersecurity, right? So Moonlighter, to also participate. First time, after 5 years of doing this, first time we're actually launching a satellite, which I think the first in the world to do cybersecurity focused mission. Which is the main mission of the satellite. And now they are using it for training, people in US Air Force for satellite security. So clearly it's very new, you could tell.
So that again shows how forward-thinking you are with your research, because you are also going to launch a cybersecurity satellite in the future. Please tell us about that.
I can't tell much about that. But yeah, so there was competition at German Aerospace Agency with designing small satellites. And we participated in this competition. And we are going to launch a cybersecurity focused satellite. We'll be the second one in the world, at least to the best of my knowledge. First one in Europe, and first one also from state of Saarland, I would say.
Yeah.
So scheduled for launch in 2025. Of course, we have to assume that the launch doesn't fail, rocket doesn't explode. But we are gonna thanks. So we are gonna work on at least right now. We are very busy with designing the system or designing experiments which we want to run in a space. With a cybersecurity focused satellite. But I can't actually give lots of details about what we are going to do. But it's going to be very interesting. So, of course, we can also test lots of or run lots of experiments which so far was never done before. And yes, it's going to be again. So we are actually, I kind of feel like we are not that far off from, for example, governments on what they are doing. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure as the time passes, we will be behind because they are going to pour money and we can't do.
Yeah, as I said, fingers crossed that the rocket is not going to explode. Where will it actually be launched? Will you be present there? Do you have to stand on a
I don't know yet. So
pedestal and
I'm
watch
sure
the rocket going up?
I don't know. So I assume that we will know more. Sometimes it's allowed to do this. So maybe. Depends. I assume that it's probably possible because oftentimes this is the case when you're launching a satellite. They allow you to have like visitor access that you can view the launch.
Nice.
And either it's going to be a spectacular, like amazing view, or it's going to be a big explosion. And just like, no.
Either way. Either way, it will probably look great on video, but
yeah. So so it depends on what the DLR policy and also like the companies who are launching the satellites.
Sure.
Sometimes they allow you, maybe not allow you directly to be there, but basically video feeds. So like they provide you private video feeds that you can actually observe the launch and also internally from the launcher or space launch vehicle.
Very, very cool. I'm definitely looking forward to hearing and seeing more of our very first CISPA Saarland satellite.
Thanks. Me too.
Okay, Ali, before I let you get back to your work on all these amazing things that have to do with satellites, I want to close off this episode with some quick questions for you. Mm-hmm. The first one is, do you use ChatGPT or other large language models in your work? And if so, for what? Or even in your private life?
I don't use it for private life. I hardly use it for my work. Maybe I use it sometimes for, actually not directly ChatGPT, but like I sometimes want to take a note of something and then I use the audio to text converter and then I just ask the ChatGPT to organize the text. So that's the max I use.
That actually works pretty good because when I was going shopping, I had like a shopping list which was not arranged into categories.
Exactly. So that's exactly how I do it. So like so if I use it, I just use it for saying something and then I say, okay, can you rewrite what I said? Yeah. And that's it. So perfect. Not much. And private life, I never used it.
Okay. So the next question is a little bit bigger, I feel, but I'm sure you'll be able to answer it. Do you feel the rapid advancement of AI does offer more chances or more risks to society?
I think there are more chances. So there's a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And in that book, actually, the author look at how every time there was a progress happening, people were thinking this is going to change everything and how it's going to be very bad for us. Yeah. Because we can't control it, the speed of it is going to be fast, and I don't know, we are going to be jobless, we are not going to have like life that we have now, like the humanity aspect of things are going to change. So there's always this fear in us humans when we don't know things, and then we tend to actually think about the worst possible thing. So I am actually optimistic. I am a pessimistic person, but I'm optimistic about the AI. Like I think it's just gonna make our life better overall, and I'm sure that there are gonna be very negative aspects of it as well, right? But at the end of the day, for everything we are inventing, there is gonna be negative aspects and positive aspects, and oftentimes we as humans will find a way to like in a total sum game just benefit from it more than it's negative, or we might use it negatively in a specific time window, and then eventually people figure out, okay, this doesn't make sense, or it's just gonna be bad for all of us. We are all in a same ship, like in that pale blue dot. So we are eventually gonna benefit from it while having the negative aspects of it. So if you look at cybersecurity, think about how it's way easier now for spammers create a way better like emails or like phishing emails for people. I think in total, it's gonna be more positive.
Okay. So, third question. Have you ever worked in the darknet or used it for personal reasons?
I actually never used it at all. I used the Tor project before in the past, but I never actually used darknet or domains which are in darknet, basically.
Okay. Is there a research problem that you would like to see solved during your time as a researcher?
So the obvious answer would be like, the satellite security issues, but I don't think it's going to be solved very fast. It's just a long game, and it's part of a bigger problem. And that bigger problem is like basically embedded system security, I would say, as a whole, which are lagging behind, and satellites are basically embedded systems. So I hope the situation gets improved there. I don't want it to get solved per se, because, I still need a job and everything. But joking. But I don't believe that we can actually solve them like that. What I actually wanted to say was, I hope that we develop more towards explainable technology. So I think the technology is getting more complex, right? And for people who are not tech savvy, like people who are not expert in things, it's going to be harder and harder to basically deal with these changes. And my hope is that basically we have more explainable technologies or understandable technologies. And this is something that I don't know if there are research domains in this area, but I hope that there was, because I think that's something that we probably will need in future.
That's interesting, because it's always what my job is trying to do. These are like really big problems, and if people want to be part of that discussion, they have to at least know a little bit about what is happening. And if, as you say, this technology gets even more obscure and no one has any idea what it is actually doing, people can talk about it. Yeah,
so my TLDR in the TLDR podcast is that basically we want to make you a researcher, instead of just trying to explain things, basically find research aspects of it. Because I think that would be an interesting research domain with the added complexity which we are going to have in the future. And you guys, I know that you are trying to explain it, but I think you can basically think about it, change your job and becoming a CISPA researcher. So.
I might put it on my list for next year. Last question. Do you have an IT security life hack for our listeners?
So for your listeners, absolutely not, because I think, and I tell you why, because I think IT security is just very complex. Of course, I can tell you use the password manager, but if there is somebody who is listening to CISPA podcast, I am sure that they're already doing that, right? And I'm sure lots of CISPA researchers already, mentioned it. Probably that's I'm 10 sure. times. So I don't think for your listener, I have something for people who are not listening. I think it's a very complex domain, and for them, you just need to be more informed. And I don't think everybody is going to be interested to be more informed. So they cannot just be focused on everything at the same time.
Yeah, sure.
So I think for them, password managers, but for your listeners, I don't have any recommendation, because I think they're already listening to interesting topics on cybersecurity. Therefore, they're already interested, and therefore they already know what they should do.
Okay. That's a valid point. Okay, Ali, thank you so much for coming down from low Earth orbit to tell us
very low Earth orbit
to tell us all about your work. I think it was very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your work on your own satellite. And,
thank you.
I'm sure you will be back on this podcast or on all our other channels that we use to communicate all the great research to the outside. So thank you for being here. Enjoy doing your research, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Looking forward to it. Bye.